The Battle of Unnumbered Tears was arguably the greatest disaster of the First Age, and one of the deadliest battles in the entire history of Middle-earth. Full of hope, the Union of Maedhros marched against Morgoth and was utterly crushed, effectively ending any chance of the Elves and the Edain defeating Morgoth without outside help. So, why was this battle such a disaster? What went wrong in the lead up to the battle, and could it have been avoided? For those who aren't aware, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, also known as the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, was the fifth major battle of the First Age. It took place in 472 of the First Age, a mere 17 years after the Dagorbragollach, the Battle of Sudden Flame, which saw Morgoth break the siege of Angband and burst into Beleriand in both east and west. But following the deeds of Beren and Luthien in 465 and 466, the Elves and the Edain began to reverse Morgoth's gains, and by 469, Morgoth's forces had been driven from Beleriand. At the forefront of this was the Union of Maedhros, a coalition formed in 468 with the goal of pushing Morgoth back into Angband and restarting the siege. In 472, the Union was ready to march on Angband, but Morgoth was aware and already had plans of his own. In a battle that lasted the better part of 6 days, the Union of Maedhros was utterly crushed. And I mean utterly. In the west, High King Fingon was killed and his army was almost completely destroyed. The Edain were almost wiped out to a man. Of the Hadorians, none returned to Dor-lomin, and of the Halladin, only 3 returned to Brethil. In the east, the Feanorians disintegrated after internal betrayal and fled to the faraway land of Osiriand. They would never take up arms against Morgoth again, and instead would spend their remaining strength destroying their fellow elves. When the battle was over, Morgoth's victory in Beleriand was assured. None of his remaining foes had the strength to defeat him, and it was just a matter of time before he mopped them all up. An important thing to note about the battle is that in the Silmarillion, Tolkien wrote that if not for the betrayal of the Easterlings, the Union could have had victory when Maedhros' army arrived on the field. But in the Children of Hurin version of the battle, which was written later, Tolkien removed this line, going with the idea that the Union was doomed from the very beginning, that no matter their skill or bravery, Morgoth's victory was guaranteed that day. So, going with this line of thinking, why was the Union doomed from the start? Firstly, the Union's problems began long before the battle. In fact, the Union itself was tainted from the very beginning. It was the Union of Maedhros, led by Maedhros, the eldest of the sons of Feanor. The Feanorians were always controversial, thanks to the deeds of Feanor and their first kinslaying back in Alcalonde. But since their arrival in Beleriand, Maedhros had done a decent job in rehabilitating their image. His plan of relocating to East Beleriand, where his more belligerent younger brothers would be isolated from the other Noldoran princes, had worked rather well. And of course, Maedhros was a good friend of Fingon, and was on good terms with Fingolfin when he was alive. But the isolation of the Sons of Feanor came to an end with the Battle of Sudden Flame. Celegorm and Curufin, the third and fifth sons of Feanor, had ended up fleeing to Nargothrond with the survivors of their people. Although well received at first owing to their friendship with King Finrod Felagund, when the quest for the Silmaril commenced, the two brothers acted in a manner which can only be described as catastrophic for relations. They effectively staged a coup in Nargothrond, leaving the beloved Finrod to die in Sauron's dungeons, and they abducted Luthien, King Fingol's daughter, with the idea of Celegorm marrying her, which would force Thingol into an alliance with them. With both Nargothrond and Doriath behind them, the two brothers would be the two most powerful princes in Beleriand. But unknown to the brothers, Thingol was not about to roll over and was preparing to march on Nargothrond. However, the brothers' plan backfired. Luthien escaped, and they were soon driven from Nargothrond, none of their former people joining them, further weakening the Feanorian cause. They would return to East Beleriand, but the damage had been done. When the Union was formed, Thingol, who was already on bad terms with the Feanorians, refused to join. When the time for battle came, only 2 elves came from Doriath, Mablung and Beleg, but Thingol forbade them from serving the Sons of Feanor, so they joined Fingon's host. It also didn't help that the Sons of Feanor demanded the Silmaril that Beren had won with his life, and when Thingol refused, well, Maedhros didn't respond, but Celegorm and Curufin vowed that after Morgoth was defeated, they would march on Doriath and deal with Thingol too. But even more disastrous was the refusal of King Orodreth of Nargothrond to join the Union. Nargothrond had swelled in power due to refugees from the Dagor Bragollach, and like Doriath, they were mostly untouched by the war. They were probably the two most powerful remaining kingdoms in Beleriand at this point. Their refusal to join the war effort was a huge loss in potential manpower for the Union, manpower that was sorely needed. Remember, the Edain were few in number at this point, and the Elves replenished their numbers very slowly, if at all. They needed every last sword. Which brings us to the next major problem. The Union, specifically the Feanorians, needed to fill their ranks, and they did, but with traitors. In the west, the Union was fairly powerful. The Elves of Hithlum, the men of Dorloman, the men of Brethil, the Elves of the Falas, and when the time for battle came, a company of elves from Nargothrond led by Gwyndor would join, and Turgon would make a surprise appearance from Gondolin with 10,000 warriors. But in the east, the Feanorians needed more fighters, and they would draw these fighters from two places, the dwarves of Ered Luin and the Easterlings who had arrived in Beleriand only a few years ago. Although the dwarves from Belegost and the Easterlings of Bor would prove to be strong and faithful fighters, many of the Easterlings of Ulfang would prove to already be in Morgoth's service, and they had more of their kinsmen in the east just waiting for the signal to come and reap their rewards. This betrayal was not discovered, and the faithless Easterlings ended up deep in Maedhros' councils, where they fed information back to Morgoth and did their best to disrupt Maedhros' plans. Even before their eventual betrayal, they were already a huge asset for Morgoth. Speaking of feeding information back to Morgoth, regardless of the Easterlings, this is where Morgoth already had a massive advantage. One of the greatest mistakes of the Union is described by Tolkien as revealing their strength too early. What he means by that is that the Union formed in 468 had driven the Orcs from Beleriand in 469, but did not attack Morgoth until 472. Basically, the Union revealed the true depths of their strength well before they were actually ready to attack, and then gave Morgoth plenty of time to plan around it. With Ulfang feeding him information, Morgoth knew the strengths and weaknesses of the Union, their numbers, and most importantly, their plan. But when it came to Morgoth, the Union were effectively in the dark. Driving Morgoth's forces from Beleriand, and even retaking Dorthonion, gave them the impression that Morgoth was weaker than he was. And while it's true that Morgoth's offensives into Beleriand after the Dagor Bragollach had mostly stalled, it was more due to overextension rather than weakness. Within Angband, he was able to hide the true strength of his own forces, and could make himself appear far weaker, lulling the Union into a false sense of security. So not only does Morgoth have a huge numbers advantage, not only does he have traitors in the midst of the Union, but he also has a complete information advantage. And we see this demonstrated on the day of the battle. The Union's plan was rather simple. Maedhros' eastern army would march openly across the plain of Enfalglyph. Meanwhile, Fingon's western army would lie in wait in the valleys of the Ered Wethrin. Morgoth would, of course, not hesitate to engage Maedhros' forces out on the plain, and once Morgoth's army was sufficiently tied up, Fingon's western army would emerge. Maedhros would act as the anvil, Fingon would act as the hammer, and upon the fields of Anfalglyph, Morgoth's army would be crushed, just like it had been at the Dagor Aglareb 400 years ago. Unfortunately for the Union, Morgoth was well aware of this trap and wasn't about to walk into it. He had a trap of his own. Maedhros' army was no threat. Ulfang's Easterlings would switch sides mid-battle and summon more of their kinsmen who were waiting in the hills. Maedhros didn't know it, but the moment he marched forth, he was doomed. The problem for Morgoth was Fingon. Attacking the foothills of Ered Wethrin would be a bad idea, so he needed a way to draw Fingon's army out onto the plain first, which wasn't the Union's plan. Once Fingon was near to Angband, Morgoth would unleash his hidden reserves and surround the western army. When Maedhros' eastern army came to help, the Easterlings would be ready. So from the Union's perspective, on the very first day of the battle, things were already not going the way they planned. Instead of being caught by surprise, Morgoth already had a poorly equipped army, his bait, assembled on Anfalglyph and marching towards Ered Wethrin. Maedhros was supposed to already be marching forth, but somehow Ulfthang, the traitorous Easterling commander, had convinced him to delay. Fingon's army was growing impatient, looking to surge forth and butcher Morgoth's soldiers, but Hurin advised caution, so they held firm. But Morgoth had ordered his underlings to draw forth Fingon by any means necessary, so they did. What followed is one of the cruelest acts of the First Age. An elven prisoner was brought forth, Gelmir of Nargothrond, and he was butchered in front of the walls of Eifel-Sirion. It just so happened that Gwyndor, the leader of the Nargothrond company, was present. He and his mounted warriors charged, cutting a bloody path through Morgoth's force. Not wishing to abandon them, the rest of Fingon's army surged forth and battle was joined. You do have to wonder, was it just bad luck that Gelmir had been selected for execution? Or did Morgoth know that Gwyndor was there? Did he know that they were brothers, and is that why Gelmir was sent forth to be killed? Given that Morgoth knew the Union's plans, he probably knew the commanders as well. You probably know what happens next, and if you don't, my War in Middle-earth series covered it in depth. To summarise, Morgoth's plan worked perfectly. Despite initial success, Fingon's army was surrounded on the plain early on the 4th day. Maedhros' army arrived, but within moments of joining the battle, the Easterlings turned traitor, and Maedhros' army disintegrated. Perhaps the only thing that went wrong for Morgoth was the appearance of King Turgon of Gondolin. Although he could not save Fingon, his brother, he broke the encirclement long enough for some of the Western army to escape, mostly back to Gondolin. But that was relatively minor in the grand scheme of things, or so it seemed at the time. So could this disaster have been avoided? Yes, obviously. The Union shouldn't have fought Morgoth on the field, especially without the power of Nargothrond and Doriath at their backs. They should have adopted a defensive posture. Sure, the Dagor-Bragollach had proven that Morgoth could overrun their defences, but they were caught napping on that occasion, and many of their forces perished in the fires that consumed Ardgallen. The Union didn't need to hold every single piece of territory. As had been proven in the aftermath of the Dagor-Bragollach, isolated Orc legions were easy pickings once they were deep inside Beleriand. But while this strategy might maintain the status quo, it wouldn't bring ultimate victory. Eventually, Morgoth's strength would cause the eventual failure of this strategy, but at the very least, they wouldn't have lost most of their soldiers over the course of 5 days of fighting, and they might have delayed Morgoth's eventual victory years, decades, or even centuries. And to be fair to the Union, that's what they were looking for. A decisive battle while they still had the strength. Or at least, so they thought. Their logic was that they had been defeated in the Dagor-Bragollach because they did not fight together. Morgoth was able to surprise them and overrun them one by one. But as we know, they didn't have the strength, they had no advantages whatsoever, and while it absolutely ended up being a decisive battle, it was decisive in Morgoth's favour. His foes had gifted him by concentrating most of their forces in one place, and after his victory, well, like I said earlier, it was just a matter of mopping up. And about 60 years later, that mop-up operation was complete, and Morgoth controlled all of Beleriand. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. If you want a closer look at these battles, I covered them all in my 33-part War in Middle-earth series. The video on the Battle of Unnumbered Tears is 16 minutes long, which is realistically only slightly longer than this video. That said, those videos are all from a narrative perspective, so I will occasionally put out videos like this that answer other questions about these battles or looks at them from a different perspective. Cheers, farewell, and remember, never take any risks in life, and if someone asks you why, just tell them what happened to the Union of Maedhros.